I thought I would do something a little bit different today that I think a lot of you are going to like. Um, I recently posted something on the Neville subreddit page that was a long excerpt with highlighted parts from Israel Regardie's portrait of Neville. It was called Neville, a Portrait, which was an essay that Israel Regardie included in his book, The Romance of Metaphysics, back in, I think, 1946. And this essay that Regardie wrote is just, in my opinion, it's fantastic. In my opinion, it's the best critical analysis of Neville's work that's been written. And Regardie was close with Neville. I posted it on the subreddit, and some people were saying, well, Regardie wasn't a fan of Neville's work, and, they weren't as close as it seemed. And, Regardie is not at the same level as Neville is in terms of understanding this stuff, etc. Some of this stuff might, or a lot of that stuff might be valid criticism of Regardie. But nonetheless, I think that this essay is just exceptional. And I know that a lot of you who are watching this have probably read the essay before. But I also know that many people have not. And I can also tell you that I had not looked at this essay in probably a couple of years. I've read it several times before, and I actually mentioned it, way back in early 2016 when I published Manifestation Through Relaxation. I said, be sure to look at Neville, a Portrait by Israel Regardie in there, because it's such a good essay, in my opinion. But what I'm getting at is that there's a lot in this essay that people should probably understand, or at least think about in regards to Neville's teaching, that they don't. And so that's why I thought I would make this video today. And we would just quickly go over some of the parts that I highlighted in this essay that I think are very valuable and underrated points about how Neville's teaching seems to work for a lot of people and why it doesn't work for a lot of people, and how it applies to just, implementing these principles in our life in general. So I don't know exactly, how this is going to go. I usually don't, read long clips like this and then commentate on them in video form. We usually do it more podcast style, but I think we're going to get something valuable out of this. So let's give it a go. So the first thing I highlighted in this essay is that Regardie writes, just as sometimes one feels that the psychoanalyst uses more ingenuity than insight in elaborating a meaning from an involved dream, so occasionally one feels that Neville is hard-pressed extracting psychological meaning from certain sections of the Bible. And this is, a lot of people have said this before. I mean, Neville's making all these assertions about what the Bible means, and who knows if they're accurate or not, in my opinion. I mean, his analysis is fascinating regardless, but Regardie's just saying that, some of this stuff seems like an obvious reach, and you can argue against that, whatever. But Regardie says, however, he presents in a simple and practical manner the advantage of realizing the identity of man's own consciousness with God. That's important. This is, your identification with God obviously makes you feel more powerful, to state the obvious, right? And your imagination as God, I mean, you couldn't have more power than that if you look at your life in that way, and, at least to some degree, right? I apologize that this shadow thing's going on in the camera when I look at this, but you guys can deal with it. So anyway, Regardie goes on to talk about how, Neville uses this I am as his kind of his backbone for, imaginatively creating. And then Regardie says this provocative line. He says, in reality, Neville is an atheist. It is conceivable that both he and his audiences would be shocked to learn of my conclusion. Yet he himself clearly and definitely states that outside of man, there is no God. If man would give up his belief in a God apart from himself, recognize his awareness of being to be God, he would transform his world from a barren waste to a fertile one of his own liking. That's what Neville said. Here he allies himself in philosophic principle with the old Buddhist reform. Gautama was a rebel against orthodoxy, against Brahmanism, against the Hindu church. And in passing, let me say that there is more than one correspondence between Neville's formulation of God and, let us say, Vedanta philosophy. I don't think that's that controversial a statement, what Rigardi says, especially in that context. You know, people were taken aback when I did this Reddit post. The subject heading was Neville is an atheist, you know, because I thought that was a good title. But an atheist, in the term that, in the way that Rigardi's using it in this essay, you know, and describing it in the same way that, like, you know, Buddha was an atheist, or you would say some of this non-dual stuff where you'd be an atheist. It's not very controversial. I mean, we got to think a little bit out of the box here, right? You know, if you're familiar with my stuff, I think you probably agree with me. This is when it starts to get very interesting. So Rigardi writes, many people, by accepting and applying the principle that Neville has disclosed to them, have experienced what they at first thought were miracles. This is no new doctrine that he has taught. It is ages old. Both the doctrine and its implications have been known and taught since time began, but they are new to some people. They have heard it for the first time, and credit must be given to him. Neville can put it over extremely well with simplicity and with force. So this is what we always talk about on the podcast, right? Like, what Neville's talking about is not new. If you're familiar with, you know, the podcast, familiar with New Thought, familiar with QA, you realize that what Neville is talking about is not new. What Neville did so well is articulate these ideas in a very powerful, dramatic fashion. And so a lot of people, even if they were familiar with some of this, you know, New Thought stuff, it seemed brand new to them. And of course, a lot of people who come into his teachings, especially today, they've never heard anything like this. So there's this perception that this is brand new. This is the only thing, you know, and it's not. You know, that's what I want to emphasize here. And so then Rigardi goes on to say, on the other hand, some other people find themselves intellectually in sympathy with Neville's teaching, yet discover they are unable to make it work. They struggle and struggle, and still no results are forthcoming. They fall by the wayside, attacking him and his system, even becoming vindictive. Some of these suggest that when some of Neville's disciplines obtain satisfactory results, they do so only because they have been hypnotized by Neville. The sort of person who can make this sort of statement has not in the least understood the fundamental psychological factor in Neville's teaching, nor the fundamental fact about Neville himself. It is a very simple fact. Neville is a dancer. Now, you might be going, what the heck? Neville is a dancer? That's why it works for him and it doesn't work for other people? But Rigardi goes on to argue, I would say correctly, in the very least, he's on to something, that Neville was obviously a professional dancer and a very, very good one. And, you know, his physicality and his mind-body relationship was very in tune. He was very aligned in that way. Rigardi writes, his every movement suggests power in repose, the effortless ease of the cat with its undisguised sensuality and force of movement. As an artist, Neville knows the value of alternate relaxation and tension. Above all, he knows the dance. His metaphysics and his system are a dance of words, a dance of mind, a dance of feeling. And unless you can dance with him, his system is likely to be unproductive. His system is in reality strictly personal, an offshoot of his own personality. To make it work as he has done, you too must become like him. That's a very interesting paragraph. And I think it explains why Neville's advice, his system, works well for some people, and for far more people does not work well. Now, I would say if you practice Neville's advice and you apply it holistically in your life, you can get it to work for you no matter who you are. But generally speaking, people aren't going to do that. And you have to be of a certain temperament to get his advice to work well for you and as effectively as Neville got it to work for himself. Rigardi writes, an artist in every fiber of his being, Neville has the capacity to sink himself wholeheartedly and imaginatively in the task at hand. He is an artist and has passion and fire on hand at every moment. The artist in him is truer than his desire to expound publicly the system he does expound. He has the ability spontaneously to apply his own teaching. It is quite another story, however, to teach the practical elements of his system to those who are not artists, who have not his imaginative or emotional capacity to engage in this ecstatic dance of the mind, which evidently means so much to him. This is why Neville's stuff doesn't work well for a lot of people, for the majority of people. They're not like Neville. And you can argue against this, but at least the general point that Rigardi is making here, I just think this is so true. And this should hopefully like debunk a lot of this cult BS that is, fed about Neville. This is very accurate analysis in my opinion. And, Rigardi continues on. I'm only reading small excerpts here. Again, you should read this entire essay, I would suggest. Rigardi says, in his audiences, there are individuals here and there that have the necessary artistic and mystical temperament to absorb the truth as Neville presents it and make immediate application of it, to demonstrate successfully, his teaching, and this is, again, we see this. There's some people, when you go online, go on YouTube or whatever, they immediately can apply this stuff. But then the assumption is that everybody should be able to apply it quickly or effectively, consistently. And it's so temperament based. It's so, you have to have a certain type of wiring, I think, to make Neville's specific advice work well for you, especially quickly, if you're not already very familiar with this kind of approach. Rigardi says, the average person with his commercial prosaic mind, his unimaginative sterile attitude towards life, uninspiring employment and home is incapable of realizing that inner spiritual being which Neville implies by I am. That's pretty critical language Rigardi's using there. But I think the point is that, the average person, Neville's very artistic and mystical instructions are not going to resonate with the average person who tries to apply his advice. Rigardi says, such a person cannot evoke that intensity of feeling, that temporary madness that Neville demands of all those who would apply his teaching successfully. That temporary madness. I don't know if it's temporary madness, but there certainly has to be that heightened something to apply Neville's advice, right? Rigardi says, of all the metaphysical systems with which I'm acquainted, Neville's is the most evidently magical. But being the most magical, it requires that very reason. It requires, for that very reason, a systemized training on the part of those who would approach and enter its portals. It requires a dynamic alteration of viewpoint, a revolutionary turning around of the mind. An entirely new and radical attitude to life and living must be developed, not merely intellectually, but emotionally. Above all, it demands that the student must learn the gentle art of relaxation, not by turning the back on body and ignoring its demands, but by learning the simple technique of so doing. Neville knows the art of relaxation instinctively. I'm sorry for the car noise in the background. Neville knows the art of relaxation instinctively. He's a dancer, and a dancer must, of necessity, relax. Hence, I believe he does not fully and consciously realize that the average person in his audience does not know the mechanism of relaxation, does not know how to let go. So this is key. I mean, this is why I wrote Relax More, Try Less. If you're trying to get into Neville's advice, it really helps to learn how to more consistently relax. And the easiest way, I would argue, to implement Neville's advice is simply to learn how to relax more. And then you can start playing with some of Neville's other ideas. But you want to start with relaxation. And Neville knew how to do this. And he practiced doing this for years and years and years. And that's something that the average person, when they get into Neville, probably is not going to be that good at. So again, great points by Rigardi. You don't have to agree with all of them, but it's very, very interesting what he's saying there, what he's saying with this. Rigardi goes on to say, it is true that Neville speaks of relaxing. Close your eyes and feel yourself to be faceless, formless, and without figure. Approach this stillness as though it were the easiest thing in the world to accomplish. This attitude will ensure your success. That's instructions from Neville. And Rigardi says, but for the average person, this is hardly adequate, which is totally true. I mean, those instructions are not enough. Rigardi says a little more detailed scientific instruction is imperative. Not only so, but the average individual does not know how to evoke powerfully his feelings and emotions. And Rigardi says he does not understand the means whereby he can arouse this passionate intensity so necessary to complete identification with or recognition of the unconditioned, faceless, formless consciousness of which Neville speaks. This is right on. I mean, this is freaking good criticism, like intelligent criticism that Rigardi's making. So this next part is absolutely fascinating. Is, you know, Rigardi saying Neville, if not totally adequate to the situation, is at least wise. In other words, he knows that people have trouble relaxing and doing this, you know, evoking these heightened feelings in a relaxed state. Neville understood this. And so Rigardi says, whether he did this deliberately or intuitively is not possible to determine. But basically the solution that Neville came up with, his step certainly serves a useful purpose. He knows that the average person approaching his lectures has had a religious training of some kind. This may have been forgotten and strayed from, but invariably it remains in the individual's unconscious in some form or another. Emotional intensity is of necessity associated with the early infantile training in religion. In other words, when you use religious language, Christian language in our culture specifically, when you use religious language, it has a tendency to evoke strong feelings in people, okay? Feelings that they might not otherwise have. Because even if you say you're not religious, so many of us have a religious upbringing, you know, subconsciously, unconsciously, where we attended church, where people spoke about God, spoke about Jesus and about sin and about liberation. So this is the kind of language that for the average person can perhaps evoke feelings that they otherwise would not easily be able to evoke. Rigardi writes, Neville therefore casts a magical cloak of religion about his system, advocating the study of the Bible as revealing this psychological drama of which he speaks. In using the Bible, he draws directly upon the level of consciousness which goes far back into time for most of us, to infancy, when the emotions were still powerfully active in our small, childish worlds. In drawing upon this level, which he does through the use of the Bible, he draws by association upon all the power and energy which are tied up in that stream of our minds. This he stimulates and whips into dynamic activity so that it will accomplish the purpose of which his system speaks. In other words, if you want to get people emotional, one of the easiest ways to do it is to start speaking about Jesus Christ. Speak about Jesus. or speak about other figures in the Bible. But speak about these dramatic religious scenes and imagery, and you're going to be able to evoke strong emotions in people more easily than if you're using regular psychological terms, most of the time, at least. This is a phenomenal point by Rigardi. Phenomenal. Rigardi says, whether this technique is wholly successful or even desirable is another story. Occasionally it works, very often it does not. Sometimes the listener is so completely inhibited and repressed that even the stimulus of the Bible is unable to awaken the magical power of the unconditioned consciousness to achieve what he wills and to make manifest that which he envisions. So in other words, even though Neville's using all this biblical imagery to kind of get people into this evocative state of, using their imagination, it often does not work. But the Bible enables him to do it more successfully than if he wasn't using the Bible, to really evoke those heightened feelings from a relaxed state. Now we get to the next interesting point. All these points are interesting. Rigardi, and again, Rigardi and Neville were friendly. Rigardi says, of all the popular teachers of metaphysics, Neville possibly is the most broad-minded. He says, so many months ago, when I was engaged in some practical experimental work with hypnosis and suggestion, I extended an invitation to Neville to be present. After the experiment was over, I put it to Neville that the crucial factor in all metaphysics and New Thought was autosuggestion. We had just witnessed a hypnotic demonstration in which an individual performed certain physical and intellectual feats which in his waking state would be quite impossible to him. Through meditation and prayer, the devotee of metaphysics is also able to perform many things which he cannot have done otherwise. It seemed to me that there must be some connection. In the case of hypnosis, heterosuggestion is responsible. In metaphysics, self or autosuggestion may be the underlying factor. Now, you know where I'm going with this, if you're familiar with this show. The connection with all this stuff that Rigardi's saying is the same connection that I think is there, and that is suggestibility, what we're suggesting to ourselves. Autosuggestion, what we're constantly suggesting to ourselves, as Coué describes it, I think is the driver of most of this law of attraction stuff. That's how things come into our lives. It's what we're constantly suggesting to ourselves throughout the day. And through Neville's approach, you're able to change what you're suggesting to yourself because you're being so dramatic that it shifts something. And so you are changing what you're suggesting to yourself on some deep level. And that then manifests in your outer reality sooner or later. Rigardi writes, it did not strike Neville as at all contrary to his principles of truth that this should be so. In fact, he accepted my idea willingly, remarking that man has become, by reason of defective early training, hypnotized out of his knowledge that he is godlike in nature. Therefore, what could be more reasonable than to employ suggestion, not as a means of superimposing additional ideas on an already heavily burdened psychological apparatus, but to awaken and to evoke from within what is already there, and that has been there for ages, dormant, latent, and unseen. Hence, his system really amounts to little more than this, when all the extraneous details are eliminated and the cloak of the Bible and the terminology are flung off. So Neville's stuff works because of suggestion, Rigardi's saying, and autosuggestion. I would agree. Rigardi says, it seems that Neville demands complete relaxation in order to become aware of the deeper levels of the mind, the unconscious. When in that ecstatic state brought about by the contemplation of phrases and verses in the Bible, you must drop into the unconscious the suggestions or desires that one wishes to be fulfilled. Such simple acceptance of your desires, Neville writes in one of his recent books, is like the dropping of fertile seed into an ever-prepared soil. When you drop your desire into consciousness as a seed, confident that it shall appear in its full-blown potential, you have done all that is expected of you. Rigardi says, this, in effect, is a perfect statement of the rationale of autosuggestion. Now, listen, Rigardi and myself, we're not making light of Neville's system here. We're just saying that autosuggestion is how things work in terms of, psychologically in our mind, and how we can get more of what we want and manifest more of what we want. It's a good thing. And Neville's system is awesome. It's just autosuggestion, what we're suggesting to ourselves, is what is making it happen. We don't have to use such, far out esoteric language necessarily to get the point across. Let me see what else I want to tell you guys here. Rigardi just says that, and I talk a lot about this in The Law of Attraction Simplified, daily and hourly, we give ourselves countless suggestions and we permit others to do the same for us. Life for many people consists of suggestion and counter-suggestion. And, we're full of, we hear so many counter suggestions of what we want. What's suggested to us a lot of the time is negative, and we buy into it instead of buying into the positive suggestions that we can make to ourselves. And a lot of the suggestions that we're making to ourselves are negative, and changing that in whatever way we can using Neville's approach or any other law of attraction approach is basically what all this is about. And then finally, near the end of the essay, Rigardi is talking about faith, because faith is something we hear a lot. You have to have faith. And I thought this was just a really interesting excerpt. Rigardi says, though emphasized by Neville, faith and belief seem to be a facade for our lack of understanding why suggestion sometimes works and why at others it fails. It is not faith in the old religious sense that is effectual, as it is necessity and the feeling that one is in extremis. When the rules of applying autosuggestion are closely adhered to in every way, success must inevitably follow. Therefore, we say such a person had faith. So in other words, faith is just autosuggestion done correctly. It's autosuggestion like Coué talked about how to do. And again, you don't have to use Coué's exact method or approach, but the underlying explanation for why autosuggestion works is what Coué is saying. And that creates, that's faith, really, Rigardi's saying. That's all faith is. It's autosuggestion done correctly. Rigardi says, moreover, we must remember that faith is an emotional quality. It evokes an intensity of feeling, which is one of the indispensable factors in the successful unconscious reception of the suggestion or the desire or the mental image. Faith has no scientific validity in itself. It is simply convenient as an emotional excitant. And when all other things fail and despair is set in, then faith stimulates the whole nature to respond to the next healing or saving situation that will arise. So, when you're in a bad situation, faith is what can pull you out of it because you become emotionally stimulated and you suggest all of a sudden something good to yourself. Grace is that. Grace, faith. It's positive autosuggestion. And what's interesting is that Coué talks about how you can autosuggest without being overly emotional. Joseph Murphy does too. You can almost be more neutral and just kind of plant that seed as well. Those are different approaches that are not nearly, that do not require nearly the emotional intensity that Neville's approach often requires. I hope this helps. There's a lot there, man. Read this Rigardi essay again. I'll link to it below. Just really interesting. A wonderful exploration of Neville's teachings and a wonderful explanation of how it connects with autosuggestion and connects with what Coué is talking about. So I hope you enjoyed all this. If you have any questions, let me know. And yeah, have a good one.